Sorry, everybody, it's that moment of silence when, there we go. Now we're all set. Okay, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So, inshallah, today we're going to continue what we had been doing. We were talking about Bab al-Mashu ala al-Khuffaini wal-Jabira. So the day before yesterday, we talked about, let's just look over it, right? We talked about the different adab for making wudu. We talked about making wudu, what's an obligation and what's a sunnah. And if we were to say something is obligatory, that means if you don't do it, your wudu is invalid. If it's a sunnah, if you don't do it, your wudu is still valid and you won't get sent for it, but you will get extra credit for doing it. Then we went into talking about al-khuffain and the different hawa'il, the different, basically the different things that are a barrier or causing an obstruction for water. So we went in details with al-khuf at least, and we talked about al-khuf and we said that al-khuf was this leatherous kind of shoe or at least sock that the Prophet and the Sahaba were wearing, and we said it would prevent the water from penetrating the foot. And but then we also had talked about the socks. Are they included in the whole ruling in al-Masah al-Khuffain or not? We went in details in that regards, and we said the preponderant, wallahu a'lam. So if we say preponderant, just by inference, you would know that there are differences of opinions. Okay, so the preponderant is that it is permissible to wipe over the sock, and the evidence we used is basically the same evidence that the other groups or the other scholars that had said that you cannot wipe over the socks. And we said that the Prophet ﷺ had said, دعهما فإني أدخلتهما طاهرتين. Leave them because I had basically inserted them in al-khuf طاهرتين, meaning that they were basically pure. In other words, he made wudu before putting them inside the khuf. So therefore, with that inference, if something maintains the purity of the feet, then therefore we can consider that as taking the same ruling as al-khuf. Okay, so we also talked about in details in regards to, well, where's the evidence that proves that you can actually wipe over the khuf/sock? We said that there were over 70 Sahaba that had narrated wiping over the sock, and we said it reached hadd tawatur. And we talked about it, tawatur, that it's basically narrated by a large number of Sahaba that basically transmitted it to a large number group of tabi'in, to then, of course, going all the way to even the times for those scholars. Okay. And we also talked about the conditions. We said in order for you to be able to wipe over the khuf/sock, one, you have to have worn it on wudu. Two, it has to be long enough to include the ankle. And three, if you are on a journey, it would be up to 15 prayers starting from the time you lost wudu. If you are a resident, it would be 5 prayers starting to count the time from the first time you lost wudu. Okay, so we've talked about that, and here's our scribbles right there. Okay, so there we go. So the Prophet ﷺ أمرنا أن نمسح على الخفين إذا نحن أدخلناهما على طهر. So that was basically the general evidence that we were ordered to wipe over al-khuf or over the sock if we had worn it on wudu. Is that necessarily something that is considered only during necessity, or is it basically something that I could do as a personal preference. You can wipe over the socks or wipe over the khuf, even as a personal preference, and does not whatsoever have to be in situations that are considered dire situations or necessity, but you can actually choose out of preference that I would like to wipe over the sock since I had worn it on wudu. It's long enough, and plus it's basically within the time frame that I'm allowed to wipe over it. So I would like to use that preference slash rukhsa slash permission that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given me. Okay, so we talked about this one. Now we went and left off at al-mashu ala al-imama, wiping over al-imama. But here's one thing. I'm going to use amama and I'm going to write down these words, okay? Muhannaka, okay? Okay, muhannaka. Okay, so what does that mean? So when we're speaking about the amama, we talked about, well, the amama itself is basically something that you would put over your head, like a turban type of thing. But when we went in details with that, we basically talked about, well, some of the things. Is that including hijab? Can women actually wear that? So for women, generally speaking, their hijab or their attire is not supposed to imitate that of men, and just as men are not supposed to imitate women's attire as well. But for women's covering, must be covering all the body, including the neck and the ears. Okay, because remember, when we talked about the borders for the face in wudu, we talked about the beginning of the hairline, basically at the forehead, and we talked about the earlobes. We talked about the chin, and we mentioned that that is basically what is considered a face, which would basically translate in here that only the face, for those scholars that had permitted that a woman's face appear, that would be the dimensions of the face. Okay, so the earlobes would not be included, neither would be the neck area. So just to note that. Okay, now did women used to wear amamas? The women didn't used to wear amama, but can the women, if they were to wear amama, and let's just assume that this turban is within their culture that women wear. It's kind of like African cultures. I know in some African cultures, women actually wear imama. So in that situation, it would be permissible on them to actually wear a imama if, of course, it's covering what we had mentioned and only appearing the face. Now, in order to wipe on the imama, there are certain conditions. So you can wipe over the imama or the hijab. Okay, so the hijab or the imama, it would actually be permissible to wipe on based on the following conditions and according to the different ahadith. Let's look into it. Number one, in order for you to be able to wipe on the imama, it basically is supposed to be covering the areas that, of course, we're not supposed to be uncovering in the head, or at least what was not the custom. So if we're talking about a imama, for example, you could say that it's covering most of the head. What about this kid? So you could see this child right there is uncovering some of the sides on the side. So in that situation, he could still wipe over the imama. Okay, even though you could see right there, little pieces of areas are basically uncovered, but he could still wipe over that. Okay, let's go over here. Number two, أن تكون العمامة محنكة. I want you to look at this one. What is muhannaka? So muhannaka simply means that is circulating around around the chin. So what does that look like? Okay, I'm going to use, here we go, amama muhannaka. I'm going to try to find something like that. So this would be well, not really. Hold on. Let's see, muhannaka and what that would look like. Okay, so kind of like there you go. This is muhannaka. Okay, so you could see right there, this would be muhannaka because it basically surrounds all all the chin area, and basically the face, only the face borders are only appearing. That would be عمامة محنكة. Now, other scholars actually said, well, it doesn't have to be necessarily coming down or going around the face, all the face. That way, some scholars actually said it can be long enough. Look at that one, long enough to basically, I know this is someone else, but would be long enough to basically cover the back, to basically have something like what they would call a tail. So we're speaking about a very long type of amama that it's covering the back end, etc. So that would be, here we go, just like this one. For this audit right here, it's got it all the way covering to the back, but every time I put my cursor, it basically goes away. But now you see right here, okay, this one that's going away. You could see that it also has a dhu'aba. What is a dhu'aba? A dhu'aba is different than dhubab, okay? Dhu'aba is basically this small thing that kind of starts hanging down from the back. That's it, dhu'aba. So in other words, it's long enough and it's covering at least most of the head, and covering as well some of the chin. And of course, it's going to be hard to at least wrap up again. So that's why it would be as well permissible to wipe over it, because to rewrap it, it's basically some tough work. Okay, let's see. There is a hadith, and part of that is this hadith that Umar ibn al-Khattab said, "Man lam yutahiru al-mashu ala al-imama, fala taharahu Allah." So that's Umar ibn al-Khattab basically repeating and quoting at least what the Prophet ﷺ had said. Whoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whoever is not purified by wiping over the turban, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not purify them. Okay, so what did he want to say? He wanted to say that the Prophet ﷺ, he had seen the Prophet ﷺ, and this is basically a quote to let them know that wiping over the turban was something that the Prophet ﷺ had done, and therefore to consider that that's not something that is part of Islam, is basically saying, well, then they'll never be purified because they had rejected something the Prophet ﷺ had permitted. Okay, so why would it be permissible to wipe over al-imama or the hijab? So if I'm wearing a hijab, can I consider that that takes the same ruling as al-imama? The answer is yes. Why? Because al-imama is not necessarily permitted because of it being a imama, but because of it being a head covering and plus covering a certain dimension within the head, of course. And therefore, if let's say a sister was wearing a hijab and it's covering, all right, doesn't have to be a imama to mean some kind of a circly thing over the head, like a turban, but if it's a hijab and covering like al-muhannaka, kind of like covering the chin area, covering the head area, etc. And it's, of course, some sisters, they like to wear hijabs, and it's basically, well, not like to wear hijabs, but they like to wear those kind of hijabs that require a lot of pins and require a lot of, I guess, a certain way. So not kind of like the Amira kind where just put it on. Especially the younger generation, they're into, I guess, being stylish about their hijab and stuff. So in that situation, can they wipe over the hijab? The answer is yes, they can, only if it's covering the dimensions that we talked about. Two, if you had worn it on wudu. So you wore it on wudu, and then you wore your hijab or your stylish hijab or your imama, and it is within the time frame. So the time frame that we did for wiping over the sock is basically going to be the time frame for wiping over the imama. Okay, let's see the other part. Let's see. يمسح على الجبيرة. Okay, what about الجبيرة? What is الجبيرة anyway? So الجبيرة would be not necessarily a cast only, but it would be anything it would be anything that would basically be considered as to protect. In other words, so it's basically something that you would cast or put around a wound. So it could be a bandage, it could be basically the cast, it could be, or perhaps even something that you put as an emergency first aid thing that you put it in order to protect the body from getting worse in its wound or something, or probably fracture, but it doesn't have to be something that is, let's say, within the limit if you didn't know how to do it, okay? But if it's something that is professionally done, then you definitely need to tell them to keep it within the limit that is necessary. That is necessary, okay? So in other words, if we have a cast, let's say you had a broken, I guess a broken, well, I mean, if it's within a joint, then what they're going to do, they're going to make the cast bigger than the actual fracture. And the reason why they do that is because they want to make sure that the whole area that's keeping that area together is basically not moving, that it's basically subtle, it's basically staying in a fixated position in order to make sure that the fracture does not grow and does not basically extend to that area, to another area. Okay, so in that situation, we're not talking about that the cast would be limited to the actual fracture, but we're talking about limiting it to what is necessary to healing the fracture, to healing whatever happened that is necessary to basically cover that area in that way. Okay, so just keeping that one in mind, because I know that some people would think that we're speaking about making it limited to the actual fracture, which is not necessarily true. It's to cover the area that is needed. Okay, the area that is needed. And okay, now, I don't like messing with cats, okay? So you go to your room. Sorry about that, everybody. Yeah, it's the cat again, and you know very well that I don't like cats, and for some weird reason, he's messing with me. Don't give me that eyelash. Okay. Okay, so what's the evidence that we can wipe over the cast? Let's see. The evidence that we could, that basically this hadith Jabir. So what happened? He said, خرجنا في سفر فأصاب رجلا منا حجر فشجه في رأسه. So what happened? They basically were on a journey, and then one of the guys basically, oh, on earth. What is wrong with you, man? Okay, sorry, everybody, that this guy has to go home. All right, I am back. So what is the evidence? So the hadith, Jabir ibn Abdullah. What happened? They were on a journey, but one guy, and I want you to look at this hadith for a number of different reasons. Let's see. He said, فَأَصَابَ رَجُلًا مِنَّا حَجَرٍ. A man was basically hit by a rock. فَشَجَّهُ فِي رَأْسِهِ. شَجَّهُ فِي رَأْسِهِ, in other words, it basically struck him hard and definitely caused some damage. And then ثُمَّ احْتَلَمَ. Then he had a wet dream. فسأل أصحابه, and he asked his friends, هل تجدون لي رخصة في التيمم? Do you find that I have a reason or have a permission to do tayammum? And they said, ما نجد لك رخصة وأنت تقدر على الماء. They said, we can't find a good reason for you when you already are capable of finding water, using water. فاغتسل فمات. Then he basically made ghusl and died as a result. What happened? Looks like the water basically contaminated the area, had it get infected or something, but then eventually the guy died as a result of an infected wound. So when they came to the Prophet ﷺ, he basically was told about him and what had happened. And the Prophet ﷺ said, قَتَلُوهُ قَتَلَهُمُ اللَّهُ. Let's look at this one. The Prophet ﷺ, let's see. He said, they killed him, may Allah kill them. Why did they not ask when being ignorant? For inquiry is the cure for ignorance. It would have been sufficient for him to perform tayammum instead of wudu, and to bandage his wound with a piece of cloth over, and then to wipe over it. Okay, so this is basically this hadith. So what does that tell us? A couple things. Number one, that basically tells us that the Prophet ﷺ, one, he got angry that they basically were considered to given the wrong fatwa. They had given the wrong fatwa, and the result of the wrong fatwa is basically that this man got infected, got infected and then died as a result. And the Prophet ﷺ said, قَتَلُوهُ. In other words, he held them responsible for the wrong fatwa that they had made, and the result, he considered that they were the ones that had been the criminals, basically, or at least the ones that had caused his death, considered them responsible for his death. Okay, why did they not ask for being ignorant when being ignorant? In other words, well, if you don't know, just say I don't know, instead of answering and giving the wrong answers and basically causing harm. It would have been sufficient for him to perform tayammum. It would have been enough basically to do tayammum. So tayammum for the whole thing or tayammum just for that area? Would have been enough to do tayammum for that area or for the whole thing. Differences of opinions between scholars, okay? And to bandage his wound basically with a piece of cloth over it and then wipe over it. So that piece of it. So was he supposed to be doing tayammum just for that area, or was it do tayammum and that would suffice for the whole thing? In other words, do we necessarily do tayammum and not do wudu at all, but my hands are okay, I can touch water, I can wash my face, and my face is not wounded right there, and I can wash my face. So does that mean I would have to wash the area that is capable of getting washed in tayammum or tayammuming, okay, and doing tayammum for the area that was basically harmed and not capable of having water over it? That's that differences of opinions that I'm talking about. So with that difference of opinion, that's why you would have, let's say, we're not just talking about the head, but let's just say the person is not capable of washing one ligament or at least one part of the body, but they're capable of washing the rest. Do we do tayammum and wudu, or do we do tayammum for that particular piece, that particular ligament that we're supposed to be washing, okay, and we would wash the rest? That's the preponderant, wallahu alam, is that you would wash the rest, but the area that you're not allowed to wash, okay, you would wipe over it. If you cannot wipe over it, then you could do tayammum for it, okay? Well, we'll talk about the details, inshallah. Okay, so what about wiping over it? What does that mean? So if let's say you've got in this example for you, in this example in the hadith, the man basically had a wound on his head, and certainly the Prophet ﷺ was saying, well, he could have just put a bandage over it, or I guess gotten some cloth and just covered the area. That way, no water penetrates into the wound, and he would just wipe over whatever he bandaged it with. Okay, so here we go. The Prophet ﷺ was giving that explanation, what alternative he has, and well, he had, since he had died, okay, what alternative he had, and he said, إِنَّمَا كَانَ يَكْفِيهِ أَنْ يَتَيَمَّمْ. He was only capable of performing, well, he could have performed tayammum, was enough to do tayammum and bandage his wound with a piece of cloth over and then wipe over it. So that's basically that evidence to prove that we could actually do both. Okay, so when we're speaking about that, okay, how do we actually do that wiping over it, and what does that even mean? So what that means is that you are going to get some water, but the water you're going to then splash away. So you're basically just barely getting your hands wet. That's what it means to wipe over it. You're barely getting your hands wet. Okay. And then you're basically wiping over that area, whether we're speaking about socks, whether we're speaking about your hijab, or whether we're speaking about al-jabira/cast. Okay, that's how you're going to wipe over it. Let's give another clear example. Imagine you're putting your hand basically under water, and then you're basically splashing the water back. Okay, you're not getting any water whatsoever from the water that you basically got your hands wet with. Okay, you're going to basically just get just simple wet hands, and then you're going to wipe over those areas. So that was basically this piece of it. Okay, now we're going to go for the other chapter. But before we go to the other chapter, any questions in regards to wiping over the cast and wiping over al-khuffain? So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to basically answer them.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam, Ustaza Umayya.
Yeah, my friend has a question. She left it before she leave. She said that if her socks, she have them and it get wet and want to change them, should she has to make a wudu or she can continue?
She would have to make wudu if she's going to take them off.
Okay.
Yep, she would have to make wudu all over again and basically start from scratch.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter the period, how long it take her to change the socks.
So anyways, if she's going to be taking off the socks, then she would have to start from scratch again.
Wudu again. Wudu.
So, yeah, of course.
Only the feet.
No, the whole thing.
From the beginning?
Yeah. Because if she takes off her socks, unless she wanted to take off her socks and go pray after wiping over them, that's fine. We said that that's a considerable opinion. Okay. We said that last week. We said that's a considerable opinion if she wants to take off her socks and go make wudu. But if she wants to replace them, yeah, definitely. If she wants to replace them, she has to start her wudu all over again.
What's the relation between upper organs and the down one?
There's no relationship. So if she
Ibadah.
is ibadah, khalas.
Okay, khalas. We can't.
Yep, that's it.
Jazakallah khair.
Wa iyyakum. Sister Samira, you wanted to say something, dear?
Yes, assalamu alaikum, Sheikha. Yeah, I had two questions in the chat. The first is, if I were to put on shoes or another pair of socks, my aunt called me about this a couple of days ago, and she said I was cold, so I put on another pair of socks. So can I wipe over both the socks?
Okay.
Yeah,
So if
shoes
she
and socks.
had both socks on, okay, and she had worn them on wudu, then she could definitely wipe over 4, 5, 6, 7. Even if it's 8 socks.
Okay.
If she had worn all of them on wudu, then in that situation, she could wipe over them.
So then if we put on our shoes and when we do a masa, we can do it over our shoes. We don't need to take off our shoes
If
to do
the
it.
shoes are high top, you had worn them on wudu and they don't have any najasa. But even if, you know what, even if they had najasa and then you, I guess, rubbed it against the floor or against the ground, you could still wipe over them.
But they have to be high top?
Well, that's because you want to wipe over them, sure, sir. Because remember, they have to cover the ankle.
But your socks inside are covering the ankle. That doesn't count.
So if you're wiping over your sock, then you would have to take off your shoe. If you're wiping over the sock, since your shoes are not high top, and then you're going to wipe over the sock.
Okay,
But
that
if you
makes
want to wipe over the shoes, then you had to have had worn your shoes basically on wudu, and they have to be high top.
right. Makes sense. Right. That makes sense. Yeah. And my second question was for the imama and the hijab. This again, you put them on after wudu. So if you don't have wudu and you put on hijab, then you can't do masa over them, right?
Right. You can't do masah over it.
Okay. There's those two questions. Jazakallah khairan.
وإياكم. All right, let's continue, my friends, and we're going to go for باب نواقض الوضوء. باب نواقض الوضوء. Okay, now what does it mean نواقض الوضوء? So generally, when we say ناقضة, we're also talking about مبطلة. So anything that is a nawaqid, it basically voids, it basically cancels out, okay? And that would basically cancel out or void the wudu itself. Now, we know we had already talked about the conditions for wudu. We talked about Islam. We talked about intention. We talked about using legal obtained water. We talked about some of that. We talked about furud. We talked about washing the face, hands, head, feet. We talked about a sunan, washing 3 times. We talked about a sunan starting from the right side. We talked about a sunan, and we said the differences of opinions in washing your nostrils, your mouth, etc. So we talked about that. Okay, but now, of course, we want to know something. Well, what nullifies wudu? In other words, what makes your wudu right now considered as nullified, and therefore, in order for you to perform a prayer or whatever requires wudu, you have to redo your wudu all over again. What are those things? Okay, so those are called mufsidat or nawaqid or mubtilat in Lugha Arabiya. So basically, they really mean the same thing. But in the books of fiqh, you might find them using the word mufsid. You might find them using the word nawaqid. You might find them using the word mubtil. Okay, but really it means the same thing. Okay, but what actually makes that? Remember, in fiqh, there is no qiyas. So you can't say, well, I'll do my own inference, I'll do my own analogy, and basically say this is to nullify your wudu, this isn't to nullify your wudu. So that's going to be problematic. So in order for us to consider or basically regard something as nullifying wudu or not, we would go back to the text itself. This isn't about what you think would make sense or not, because remember, all of these, they're called tawqifiyya. They're basically to be assigned by Ishara. What is Ishara? Ishara is not the street. Ishara is basically the legislator, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or al-Wahi itself. Okay, so let's see some of the different things. Of course, we know some of the things, they basically nullify the wudu because they're considered as direct nullifiers. So we're speaking about things like urine, stool, whatever comes out of well, basically the private part. But here's one thing I would like to say. When you look at this one, what is al-kharij min as-sabilayn? So women don't actually have sabilayn. Women actually have 3. First of all, let me break down the word sabil. Sabil means exit. Okay, sabil means a pathway or an exit. So if we're talking about that women's anatomy, it's not sabilain, but it's actually 3. But you want to keep in mind that the kharij min as-sabilain, this general term, that was actually used by the scholars when, think of it as canonizing fiqh, when they were basically setting it in a way where it is more of like the legal terms, etc., to basically make it as not necessarily just putting the hadith right there, but laying out, let's say, those points in a way to make it easy for people to learn Islam in a way where the scholars of fiqh are deriving the rules and making it easy for you to basically understand. Okay. So when we're speaking about al-kharij min as-sabilain or al-kharij min as-sabilain, anything that exits the 2 pathways, what pathways are we talking about? We're talking about the normal pathway of basically urine is exited, and 2, basically defecation. Okay, but of course for women, we have a place for urine, got a place for defecation. We also have a place which is basically the vaginal area. So that's the 3rd pathway. Okay, so we're going to talk about that because there's one thing that basically exits that pathway, which basically is cervical mucus. And then what about other discharges that women basically may have, maybe because of an infection, etc.? And is that included within al-kharij min as-sabilain? How do we understand that? So that's one thing that I'm definitely going to go in some details with that. So stay tuned with that. Okay. So let's see, or even the sexual organ. So is that necessarily, when we're speaking about sexual organ, for women, we're talking about the vaginal area. For men, we're talking about the male private area. So I guess, we'll talk about that in just a bit. Okay, so if we're talking about direct nullifiers, we're speaking about an actual substance that we are basically seeing that is considered impure and exiting our body. Okay, that's basically a direct nullifier. The indirect nullifiers would basically be the different reasons that would, one, we would consider that possibly that they would have probably induced one of these direct nullifiers without us knowing. So in that situation, things like going into a coma, or probably going to sleep, or probably maybe losing the mind, basically getting some kind of mental illness and intermittently, or even if we're talking about something that probably happened for a long time, is that indirect nullifier, does that mean I lost my wudu or not? So yesterday I had somebody send me a question, and they were doing what is that, endoscopy or something like that? And of course, when you do that, they give you sedation, so it's not necessarily anesthesia, but they would give you a sedation, and certainly in order to do the procedure, they would have to give you IV just to make sure nothing happens. And she was asking whether that would nullify her fast or not. So the whole idea of sedation, for example, if it's temporary, it wouldn't nullify your fast. We're talking about temporary. Of course, it's not going to be forever, but we're speaking about temporary to mean not taking the whole day, but it's only, let's say, an hour or 2, which is pretty much how long it lasts for the endoscopy, an hour or 2 or even less. Okay, but the procedure itself would take some time for them to prepare you and all of that. So anyhow, speaking about the time frame for fasting, for example, it would only take that much. But what would nullify the fast would basically be the substance that they would be inserting, such an IV, different medications that are considered carrying some nutrition in it. Of course, the IV is basically water and saline, but at the end of the day, it's basically considered something that you are injecting your body, or at least they're injecting into your body. It would be considered as nutrition and keeping you hydrated. Okay. And certainly they would need to put that IV just in case you lose oxygen, just in case they needed to put in a medication or anything of that sort. They would basically have to do that. So that is one reason. But the anesthesia itself or the sedation itself, if it is temporary, it does not nullify your fast. I know I'm talking about fasting here, but if we're speaking about wudu, then it does nullify the wudu. Okay. Even if it's an hour of sedation, because you would not be able to know whether you had passed wind or not. Well, if you're going to be doing endoscopy, for sure, with the pressure, you're most likely going to be passing gas without you realizing, okay, with the pressure and all of that. Okay, so we're speaking about even if you were to sleep for 5-10 minutes, it's not an issue of the duration of the sleep. It's an issue of if you had fallen asleep and you were in a position of, let's say, a complete body, your body is completely laid against probably a bed or a sofa or whatever it is, then all scholars would agree that even if it's a 3-minute sleep, then in that situation, you would basically be considered that you would have to redo your wudu. They did have differences of opinions, though, on whether you would have to redo your wudu if you had fallen asleep and even snored, okay, but you were sitting on your buttocks with your back against basically the wall, and you're sitting down. And the reason why they had differences of opinions is, number one, the Sahaba had mentioned that they would be sitting, listening to the khutbah, and some Sahaba, they would even hear them snoring, and then they would wake up when it's about the time to pray, and even though they had been snoring, in other words, they were really completely asleep. They had already fallen completely asleep, and it was during the khutbah, but then the Prophet ﷺ didn't order them to redo their wudu, even though it was right there in front of everyone that person was definitely snoring, that person was sleeping, and not necessarily paying attention to the lecture, or at least the ceremony. Okay, so that's that place of differences of opinions. Just noting that one, because remember we said, and I promised that we're going to make it a summarized one and not necessarily very lengthy. Okay, let's see. When we're speaking about in the details in regards to al-kharij min as-sabil, whatever that comes out, let's see, what did he say? He called it stool and urine exits. Okay, okay, I guess he broke it down and didn't necessarily say what leads the pathways. I think his translation is definitely better, because that would be too ambiguous. Okay, such as stool, wind, urine, sperm. You mean it wouldn't be called sperm per se, it would be called semen. Pre-seminal fluid, unusual menstrual blood, unusual menstrual blood. What is unusual menstrual blood? What did he want to translate? دم استحاضة? No, absolutely wrong translation. Absolutely wrong translation. It's not unusual menstrual blood. No, the absolutely wrong translation. Let's break it down and see what the right translation is. Okay. Al-kharij min as-sabilayn. So number one, there's no differences of opinions. If we're speaking about urine exiting the body, that breaks the wudu, unless the person is on dialysis. Okay. Unless the person is on dialysis, then they would just ignore that they would make wudu and ignore that the urine is basically exiting the body as a direct wudu nullifier, because they definitely do not want to stop praying. Okay. So their dialysis should not harm their prayer, and just pray. Okay. And let's see. Number 2 is basically feces, or basically just different things that what are they called? Defecation. There you go. So that would basically for sure nullify wudu. Okay, and now here's one thing. It is very common that I would get people that have constipation. In severe constipation, they would basically have GI issues, and they would be continuously passing gas. It's continuously passing gas. Okay, so in that situation, they would ignore the gas. It's okay. Yes, you were praying and the gas is being passed and you're just continuing. Then in that situation, since you just made wudu for that salah and you have a problem with that GI problem and you're continuously passing gas, just like the person that is doing dialysis and they're continuously basically with that urine bag, they've got it right there. That's the same thing. They would just ignore it and don't worry about that urine, and don't worry about basically the wind if it is continuous. Same thing for women that are basically having continuous non-menstrual. So it's not the unusual menstrual. This is absolutely the wrong translation. It's basically non-menstrual bleeding, and it's also not postpartum as well. Because if I were to say non-menstrual, something that is not menstrual, you might say, well, okay, yeah, that means postpartum. So that's why I'm saying it's not menstrual and it's not postpartum, but it's basically vaginal bleeding, even though, yes, it's coming out of that pathway that we talked about earlier, but in situations when we're speaking about an illness. So that's what non-menstrual and non-postpartum, basically, that type of bleeding, then in that situation, it would be within the category of just vaginal bleeding. Okay, that vaginal bleeding, which is not menstrual, not postpartum, would basically take the same ruling as the person on dialysis or the person that was continuously passing wind. Okay, so in that situation, do they have to redo all the 3, whether the person dialysis, the person is continuously passing wind, or the person that is basically having this, let's call it the vaginal bleeding that is not menstrual? It's istihada. Okay, when we say istihada, we're speaking about bleeding that is not menstrual and not postpartum. Okay, so in that situation, do they have to redo their wudu for every salah? Majority of the scholars, they said that they have to redo their wudu for every salah. Okay, the Maliki madhab, they basically said no, they don't do wudu for every salah, at least if the nullifier was the same reason for every salah. So if we're talking about this woman that is having istihada bleeding, the vaginal bleeding that we were just talking about, and hey, she has fibrosis and it's continuously, it's all day. She's continuously, yes, she's changing pads, or probably not even changing pads all the time, but basically having all this bleeding all the time. Does she have to redo her wudu for every salah? According to the Malikis, no. According to the Malikis, she doesn't have to do wudu for every salah. According to the Malikis, if we're speaking about the same quote unquote nullifier happening, she already has a reason to pray with that reason being present. So according to the Malikis, it wouldn't make sense to ask her to redo her wudu for every salah when anyways that breaker was still persistent. Okay, So that actually makes a lot of sense. But the other scholars, the majority of the scholars, they basically said she makes wudu every salah because the Prophet ﷺ basically told that Sahabiya, فَتَوَضَّئِ وُضُوءِكَ لِلصَّلَاةِ, just redo your wudu, or he said make wudu the way you would do for your salah. So some scholars understood it based on that hadith, or at least the inference is that she would make wudu for every salah and don't worry about whatever is being exited right there. Okay, so just wanted to note the Maliki opinion, which is actually rarely mentioned. I thought it would be important to say. Same thing if we were talking about, of course, here, feces or even wind, same thing. Okay, if something is exiting the body, but it is not feces or urine, so what is the ruling there? So in general, it still is considered as a wudu breaker because all scholars had actually agreed that if it is exiting from basically exiting from those pathways. I disagree with the author because there is no ijma'. Okay, just a note. There is no ijma', and the claim that there was an ijma' / a unanimous agreement on that is not accurate. I know he said أَوْجَاءَ أَحَدٌ مِّنكُم مِّنَ الْغَائِطِ, and he used the evidence, the general wording of that ayah, or if any of you were to come from al-gha'it, which basically was a word. So that let me break down the word al-gha'it. Al-gha'it is not feces. Al-gha'it is the area that they basically used to go to. It's a low area. They would choose a low area within, I would say, within that area, and that would be considered the public area's bathroom, and that's where they would do their natural business right there. Okay. Now, one thing is that he basically used the inference that this ayah is saying, if any of you were to come back from that area, and you basically had done, let's call it your private business, in your private business, this is what you did, and certainly it is to either defecate, or it is to urinate, or it is basically discharging the different fluids. Okay, so he's basically saying, well, all those fluids that are coming from the private part, that's our evidence to prove that that is going to be within anything that leaves the private part, therefore is najis. Okay, so he's basically saying there is an ijma', but this one actually right there takes us into, well, not quite. It's a wudu breaker. Maybe let's go into some details to understand whether it is or not. And let's say, and he said, وَإِن كَانَ مَنِيًّا أَوْ مَذِيًّا. As for sperm, you mean the semen, and pre-seminal fluid, they nullify ablution according to the Sahih. Okay, so it's not sperm per se. Sperm is basically the thing that, okay, no, it's semen. And as for semen or pre-seminal fluid, what was the difference? So il-mani would be what the male ejaculates. Okay, that's semen. What the male ejaculates basically after the end of intimacy. Okay. For il-madhi, that's the pre-seminal fluid, basically when there is an arousal, the body basically prepares itself for basically the sexual relations, okay? And that's what the body basically is, that pre-seminal fluid. And same thing for women. It's called pre-seminal fluid, but of course women don't get semen or at least many, but it's still called many, even though it's not actually what it is. But in the end, of course, if they reach the climax, so if a woman reaches the climax, and which basically is called orgasm, then in that situation, she would have to make ghusl, okay? And if the man ejaculates, they would have to make ghusl. If we're speaking about reaching the climax, making ghusl, okay, regardless of how this happened, whether we're speaking about wet dream or whether we're speaking about personal stimulation or whether we're speaking about an actual intimacy happening, okay, that basically means the person is required and obligated to basically do complete showering, okay? That's number one. Now, the pre-seminal fluid takes a different route, okay? So if we're speaking about pre-seminal fluid, we're talking about some arousal, we're speaking about some certain discharges that happened. They didn't reach the climax, okay? But they basically started getting those fluids, okay? Because of as a result of arousal, okay? Now, whether it's foreplay, whether it's different stimulations, whatever it is, then in that situation, the man is supposed to be washing all the private area, including the testicles, for the woman, basically doing a complete istinja, plus basically right there. So the man and the woman, if they wanted to do their wudu, it would have to be istinja, complete istinja, and then of course complete wudu. Complete istinja plus complete wudu, just to note right there. Okay, so that is not necessarily ghusl. So if it's a pre-seminal fluid, that would be complete istinja plus wudu. But if it's semen or at least a complete orgasm, basically arousal, reach a climax, then in that situation, that would be ghusl. Okay, so what's the evidence on that? Well, basically the ahadith that are authentic ahadith. So are these things exited from basically al-kharij min as-sabilain? The answer is yes, they're exited from al-kharij min as-sabilain, but they have their own rulings on what we're supposed to be doing with it. Okay, let's see. كذا ينقض خروج دم الاستحاضة. Oh, that's a differences of opinions between scholars. What is dam al-istihada? We talked about dam al-istihada. It's basically the bleeding that is not menstrual and also not postpartum. Okay, is that a wudu breaker? Is it impure? Is it something that you have to redo your wudu for every salah for? That's that area of differences of opinions between scholars. Okay, just to note that. Same thing if we're talking about vaginal discharge. Okay, vaginal discharge. There is not a single hadith or an ayah that talked about vaginal discharge. Majority of the scholars had considered, well, based on let's call it the default generalized ruling, anything that exits the private pathway is basically going as part of this inference, that it's part of what exits the pathway when a person is doing that business, that private business, basically the call of nature, okay? And majority of the scholars considered, well, if it's exiting the private part, and certainly if we're speaking about that exiting from the private part, then that means it's by inference, it's basically impure. There are some scholars, and it's actually a considerable opinion, that there is no hadith and there is no ayah in regard to the vaginal discharge, and to use the generalization of al-kharij min as-sabil is not accurate. because women were continuously getting the vaginal discharge because this is basically how their body functions. And especially if we're speaking about a high climate, we're talking about younger generation girls, especially. Of course, the older you get, the less of that. Well, not only the older, but also certainly the closer you are to your fertility days, that's when it becomes basically with a certain texture. And of course, it becomes, let's say, less elastic, and the farther you are from your fertility days, or et cetera. So I'm not going to get into that, but we know that women during the time of the Prophet ﷺ were getting all that basically vaginal discharge, and there was no hadith to basically instruct them in that regards. And they said, well, if there aren't any hadith, then we cannot necessarily use the general rule that we basically had used as an inference and then apply it on each and every single discharge, because the Prophet ﷺ didn't mention anything about it. So that was one thing that basically they had debated. Well, if I don't have a hadith, I don't have an ayah, then how can you make a certain general rule and basically apply it on all and say, okay, well, I made a rule that was an inference, and then I'm going to use that and basically apply it right there. That was the debate. Okay, so you had, in regards to the vaginal discharge, remember, this is a class where I'm summarizing things and not necessarily going into all the details, even though I went into lots of details. But the first opinion is that it's not a wudu breaker, not impure, They're basically meaning pure. And that basically means if it's not a wudu breaker, it's not impure, or it's not well done. It means it's pure, okay? And therefore, it doesn't affect your wudu. You don't even have to worry about it, okay? That's the first opinion. The second opinion basically said, no, it's a wudu breaker and it's pure. So what does that mean? If I'm saying if it's a wudu breaker, that means if you get this discharge, you would have to redo your wudu, and then you don't have to wear those carefree panty liners and all of that, because if it goes on your undergarment, you don't have to worry about it, because according to the second opinion, that it's not impure, it's pure, basically. Okay. The third opinion, so they basically said, well, it's not a wudu breaker, but it's impure. So the opposite of the second opinion. Okay, it's not a wudu breaker, but it's impure. And the fourth opinion, they basically said it's a wudu breaker and it's impure. Did I mention that one? Is that a fourth opinion? Did I mention that one? Okay. So basically, all those opinions are out there. And especially for girls 15, 16, probably until age 24, something around there, I would, always tell the girls that those opinions that had said that it's not a wudu breaker and that it is not an impure thing and that it's pure is a considerable opinion, because we have had a lot of girls within that age group basically stop praying because that was so continuous that they just couldn't keep up with their wudu. They would make their wudu, and then while they're starting to pray, they could already feel it coming down again. So I would like to tell them that it's not a wudu breaker. That's a considerable opinion because there aren't any hadith. So just dealing with teenagers, this was a very common thing, and I always needed to emphasize it, that it's okay. You can do your salah And it's not just letting you get a short pass or some pass for it. But no, this is a considerable opinion. Okay, that it's not a wudu breaker. You don't necessarily have to wear even the panty liners, because I know that some girls actually get infections from those. You don't even have to wear those if you don't want to. Okay, and just work on your salah and don't worry about that. And that's a considerable opinion. Okay. If there are any questions, you are probably shy, even though you had seen me talk in such details, but some still don't want to, I guess, be heard. That's okay. Let's see. So what's the evidence that they had said that, yeah, you would still make wudu for every salah? And whether we're speaking about istihada or whether we're speaking about, the vaginal discharge, basically said, فَتَوَضَّئِي وَصَلِّي فَإِنَّمَا هُوَ عِرْقٌ. That's the hadith that they quoted. فَتَوَضَّئِي, then make wudu and pray, for it is a عِرْق. It's basically, what is al-'irq? Al-'irq is basically a vein. Okay, so just perform ablution and then offer prayer, for it's only due to a vein. Okay, so they basically took this quote, فَتَوَضَّئِي, and make wudu and go pray. And you could say, إِسْنَادُهُ كُلُّهُمْ ثِقَاتٌ. So is it that the Prophet ﷺ was ordering her to redo her wudu, or is he just telling her, well, you could just make wudu and just pray? Or is he ordering to make wudu at least once and continue to pray? So that's that whole area differences of opinions. Okay. So what's the evidence in regards to passing wind? I mean, it's just wind passing. Well, remember, we've got hadith that are authentic, plus there is an unanimous agreement. What's the evidence? لا يقبل الله صلاة أحدكم إذا أحدث حتى يتوضأ. The Prophet ﷺ basically said, Allah will not accept the prayer of anyone if he passes urine stool and breaks wind until he performs ablution. Okay, so the word ahdath, which is right there, okay, they basically wanted to break it down for you, okay? But the word ahdath, the Prophet ﷺ had explained what al-hadath was, because the word ahdath actually means to, to cause an effect, okay? To cause an effect. But Islam is a religion of adab. Islam is a religion of adab. So the Prophet ﷺ explained to them what he means by the word ahdath in other ahadith, in order to let them understand, well, what does it really mean? And now you understand the word to cause an effect, or to basically the call of nature and what that looks like. So basically the word ahdath, and here I guess the translator for this book, he basically just broke it down for you and said, well, ahdath is, anyways, according to other ahadith, is basically to pass urine, stool, and break wind. So I'll just break it down for you. But I just want you to see the word ahdath and just break it down, and let's say unbreak it for you, because he had broken it down. I'm here going to basically clarify it. And the Prophet ﷺ, in regards to the man that passed the wind, and what is the story behind this guy? So this guy had a GI problem, it seems. And he was saying, well, my stomach is always making, who knows, but something, I could always feel it. He's always feeling it in his abdomen. But then he was wondering whether he should basically leave salah every time he hears a crackling sound in his abdomen or not. So the Prophet ﷺ tells him, لا ينصرف حتى يسمع صوتا أو يجد ريحا. He said he would not leave until he hears a sound or finds a smell. So that's during that moment of doubt. Okay, لا ينصرف. In other words, continue your prayer unless you are certain that something exited the body, whether we're speaking about exiting a smell. In other words, you are now very certain it's not just a crackling sound that you're not sure where it's coming from, but this is right now something that you know in certain that your abdomen was doing its homework. So you were capable of finding a smell or probably a sound that is loud enough for you to know that it definitely did a huge thing. Okay, let's see. أما الخارج من البدن من غير السبيلين. As for the things that basically exit the body and that are not necessarily part of the private part. Okay, so what do those look like? Okay, let's see. According to hold up, let's see what he okay. Such as blood or even al-qayn. Okay, let's see. He said lullifying ablution is mental unconscious. No, that's not what it's saying. So anything that is leaving the body but outside of the private area. Okay, that's not what he's translating here. That's a wrong translation. Among the things nullifying ablution that is outside of the private area, okay, such as blood, let's say nosebleed, vomit, okay, or probably other types of injuries. That's basically other types of injuries. We're talking about severe bleeding right there, stabbing, etc. Okay, other than a nosebleed. Those are basically a place of differences of opinions between scholars on whether they do nullify the wudu or not. Okay, here he's saying, and the preponderant is that it doesn't nullify wudu, but if the person had basically made wudu to stay away from the differences of opinions, that would be best. Okay, let's use the term and help you remember that term. الخروج من الخلاف أولى. الخروج من الخلاف أولى. What is الخروج من الخلاف أولى? الخروج من الخلاف meaning that staying away from the differences of opinions is always best and is always your priority. Okay, let's see. What about the other things? Let's see, oh, there you go. I basically missed out. Okay, so this is this, and I thought he had misworded. Okay, so all right, أخطأت في حق the interpreter. Okay, so let's see. He said, as for whatever comes out of one's body other than urine, stool, and then the aforesaid secretions, such as blood, nosebleed, and the like, scholars disagreed on. Okay, there you go. Yeah, this is what that was saying. Okay, I thought he jumped into here. Okay, let's see. From the things that nullify wudu are basically زوال العقل أو تغطيته. It's basically mental unconsciousness. So what does a mental unconsciousness mean? Mental unconscious, I mean, when we speak about mental illness, are we speaking about that mental unconscious that the person goes into, something like a coma? Or are we talking about mental unconsciousness like going to psychosis or anything of that sort? The answer is we're speaking about mental unconsciousness where the person is not aware whether they had passed wind or not. But wait a minute, what about people that are probably going through maybe schizophrenia, psychosis, bipolar, all those different things? And of course, whether we're speaking about bipolar, whether we're speaking about schizophrenia, we're speaking about different stages, or at least different levels and how severe the situation is, or even OCD. And certainly, certain situations can actually mean that the person had lost their ability to fully be considered within the category of conscious or fully aware of and basically fully held accountable. Are they fully accountable for what they're doing or not? Okay. In some situations, they may not be accountable and held accountable, not for their prayer, not for their their fast, but if they had money, their guardian would basically pay zakat on their behalf. Okay, their guardian would basically pay zakat on their behalf. But when we're speaking about salah, we're speaking about a person, if we're speaking about an extreme case where they're confusing everything. They think you're attacking them. You're somehow working with the FBI and they're confusing everything. Or probably we're going into maybe an elderly or even a little bit younger, maybe going through Alzheimer's. They don't even recognize who you are. Then in that situation, this person could be غير مكلف. They could be not held accountable and not even required to pray, fast, and even do the other obligations. Just a note. Okay, so how do we know if they are or they are not? So in general, there is something called that الجنون المطبق والجنون غير المطبق. Let me write that down. There's الجنون المطبق والجنون غير المطبق. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, so الجنون المطبق would basically be considered that the person is basically mentally ill, but they're completely unaware of the world around them. They don't know who you are. They probably don't even know who they are. One day they're calling themselves Chris. The other day they're giving you a new name. You ask them when their birth date is. They're giving you a completely way off date. They probably think that they're living during the time of, who knows, Napoleon. And they're really convinced that, yes, they're living during the time of Napoleon. Or they're probably thinking that they're the presidents of the US or who knows what they're. This is Junoon Mutbaq. They're not held accountable. Even if they were to make talaq, their talaq is not valid. Even if they were to pray, they're probably praying even. Wadu, no wadu, they don't even know what they're doing. That's Junoon Mutbaq. Junoon Ghayr al-Mutbaq is basically, it's classified as Junoon. It's classified as Junoon as a type of person lacking conscious. They're not fully mentally unaware. You ask them, what's your name? They'll give you their name. They'll give you their birthday. They'll give you lots of information that is some accurate, some not accurate. And yeah, they can confuse things. They'll basically go into awareness of a lot of things. You give them a book to read. They'll be capable of reading everything very well. Okay, but then you might say something and they'll think, oh, what did you mean by that word? You looked at me on the other day and you basically meant to do this or meant to do that, and etc. They're confusing different matters. Okay, so this is within the classification of Junoon Ghayr Mutbaq. Okay, Junoon Ghayr Mutbaq. So it is considered as a type of a mental illness, but it's not a complete one. Okay, so in that situation, we would then go into another classification. Is it temporary? Is it something that is intermittent? She's probably, or he is taking some medications, and these medications, hey, makes them basically aware and doing good for a couple months, and they go into their state back again, confusing everything. So this is Junoon Ghayr Mutbaq. It comes and goes, intermittent, etc. So in that situation, if during those days when they are aware of what they're doing, aware of what it means to apply the rule, aware of what it means to understand how to apply salah, siyam, etc. If they're aware, then they'll be held accountable. If they're not aware, she's basically believing that hey, the government is putting something in the water, and if she uses water, she's basically gonna die because the government is putting something in the water to basically make people, I don't know, lose their skin or whatever it is, and goes into this kind of imagination. Okay, then in that situation, she's not held accountable and certainly would not be required to pray because this is junoon, غير مطبق, but during that moment, she was in a situation where basically went into the border of junoon مطبق. She was unaware, okay? Junoon مطبق, not fully aware of what's going on. Okay, so just wanted to mention that one. So in situations where, let's say we've got a person went into this stage where they were not aware, and then 2 hours later, you could say, oh, they're talking to me normally. That's like, boom. It's like they just woke up. But just 2 hours ago, they were completely off. Okay, so in that situation, while they were in the state, they were completely off. They lost and considered they lost their wudu. So when they go back to being aware, that's when they would have to basically make their wudu and start praying. Now, it's important, of course, it's a very, I guess, a very simplified, I guess, classification and putting them in these two categories, but this is just to make things easy and basically to help us understand al-fiqh and understand what we see around us. Okay, so if the person basically loses their mind, whether with junoon or basically sleeping or probably a coma, then in that situation, they would have to redo their wudu, even though nothing had exited from their private part, because keeping in mind that it's not only stuff that exits the private part is a wudu breaker, but there are other things that break the wudu that are not necessarily exiting from the private part, but let's call it the process of mind or the process of body. Okay, so the process of body is that it is possible that the person might have passed wind, the person might have probably gone to the bathroom, whatever it is. And in that situation, we need to make sure that the person understands the rule that in situations where you lost your mind, basically temporary. I don't know if there's any other word that I could use, so help me, and they definitely would be happy to learn from all of you. Okay, let's see. Number 3, which is really strange to some, eating camel's meat, little or much. Okay, what is the point? Just camel's meat? So what about, beefsteak and all of that? No, that's not included. Okay, hold on. Let me break that for you. Eating camel's meat, there are authentic hadith in regards to that. Okay. And the madhab Hanbali in particular was rather probably strict about that. Or maybe I shouldn't be using the word strict because it might actually contain some qillat adab with these scholars, madhab Hanbali. Let's just say they were really serious about that. Let's use that one. Okay. For the majority of the other madhahib, they did not consider that you would have to redo your wudu from eating camel's meat. Okay. But here's a note. Some scholars actually said that you would even do wudu from everything that massatin nar, that fire touches. So we're speaking about things like barbecue. Okay, that you would do wudu from barbecue. Yeah, so let's say, I don't know, you make hamburgers, you make steak, I don't know, chicken, and basically put it over that barbecue. And since there's fire there, they basically considered that you would have to redo your wudu from that. I'm not going to go in details with that, but just to let you know, this is a considerable opinion. So since this is a considerable opinion, is it best to just stay on the safe side? Certainly, you could stay on the safe side. Is it being phonetic if I just always stay on the safe side? The answer is no, you're not being phonetic. You're being a good Muslim. You're being a muttaqi. You're being a person that wants to take their religion seriously, and you are being a person of taqwa. Okay, so because we would basically have different attendees that are, some are starting with their Islam, some are advanced, some are basically new to their practice, some are still probably new Muslim. So in that situation, I would lay out the differences of opinions and I would say, hey, you work out on what level and how far you're capable of staying within the safe side, within, let's say, that area where there's no differences of opinions, but I will lay out the differences of opinions for you to know that, one, don't be phonetic on others and insist that there's only one way to do it. So that's for you to embrace, I guess, the different scholars and also the different communities. You could be having somebody that's probably Hanbali, somebody that is Hanafi, somebody is probably Shafi'i, and probably somebody that is even part of a Zahiri madhab. So just understand that if there are differences of opinions, learn how to embrace them. That's number one. Number two is that I would also mention the differences of opinions, and I would say, this is a considerable opinion, and that's a considerable opinion, and this one is not a considerable opinion, to help us understand the borderlines of where the text itself, considerable opinions, had included such opinions, and therefore for you to know where your area of premise is. Okay, so if you are capable, like let's say the sisters that have continuous vaginal discharge, they're probably always working out and probably always sweating, all when younger age, etc. She's always having that vaginal discharge. So in that situation, let's just say you took the opinion that vaginal discharge, let's just assume you always do a really good job and that you consider a wudu breaker and consider it as impure. Good for you. Okay, you want to do that? That's fair. But let's say she was going out, okay, on a picnic with her family, and she basically was so disgusted from using those bathrooms, public restrooms in the picnic areas. Oh my God, horrible. Okay. And of course, those kind of bathrooms, those kind of stalls, definitely horrible. Didn't know what to do. Okay. So can she use basically that opinion that said it's not a wudu breaker and it's not impure, and said, you know what, I'm going to use that other opinion because, to be honest, those bathrooms, those stalls are disgusting. Don't want to go in there. I'll just, even though I normally take that other opinion, but today, right now at least, I want to take the other considerable opinion because I cannot handle this. The answer is yes, you can. Okay, just wanted to know because that's a considerable opinion. Okay, so just to note. Okay, any questions before we, because it is 11:39 and I didn't give you guys a break. I know that piece of it. Let's see okay, let's just finish this one and then we'll inshallah.
I think we had something in the chat.
We did? Okay, well, I can't see it, Nuda, because you're asking me to take down those boxes. So let me take them alone.
Okay.
Yeah, so if I take out those boxes, I won't be able to see what's in the chat. Let's see. If I were to put, oh, we mentioned that one. Just a reminder, if you didn't register, please register. Don't forget tonight. Okay. So here's one. Should one change underwear or clean the underwear before Salah? So like I said, there are differences of opinions between scholars. So that's your choice. I would say it that way. But in general, in general, I would say if you could stay on the safe side, I would still take in consideration how old you are and perhaps your, let's say, your situation. And I would always recommend stay on the safe side. But if that is hectic on you, I would say, hey, I told you there are differences of opinions between scholars, so I don't want you being too hectic on yourself, because definitely, one, using panty liners, I was reading these articles that were talking about those panty liners actually making more infections for women. They're not necessarily the smartest thing to do or even the smartest thing to use. So I'll let that be for the OBs to discuss it. So I'm not going to go into that, but certainly you don't have to always wear panty liners, and you certainly don't have to always change your undergarment. That would definitely be very hectic to always carry, I guess, a whole closet with you everywhere you go. Okay, just letting you know there are differences of opinions. Okay, how about constant never-ending period you get after being on birth control? Can you pray? How about vaginal gas wind if passed during prayer? Okay, so the first one, the never-ending period, there's no such thing as a never-ending period, but in general, you know what? Should we do that right now, or is that coming up? That's going to be coming up, but I'll just make it really quick. Okay, I'll make it really quick. There's no such thing as a never-ending period, but here's one thing. Okay, I'm going to make it really quick. Okay, so number one is that a woman, let's say the regular cycle is between 21 to 28 days. Okay, that's a regular cycle. 21 to 28 days. That's basically your cycle. And the cycle is basically going to be having, the Prophet ﷺ said, damun aswadun yu'rif or yu'raf. Okay. What does that mean? So we're speaking about blackish color bleeding. We're speaking about having a smell. We're speaking about that it's thick. Okay. So three things. Let's write them down. Okay. Let's write them down. Number one, we're speaking about blackish, darkish color. Okay. Number two, we're speaking about a smell, basically having an odor. And number three, we're speaking about that it's so thick that even when it goes into the toilet, it basically goes into the toilet like a syrup. Okay. And number four, let's put that right there. There's a specific timing for it. Okay, specific timing, and basically in this situation, 21 to 28 days.
I just want to say that I'm so glad that we have you as, because I mean, like, subhanAllah, just asking a sheikh who's a male, like that would be, you can't even ask that. You know what I mean?
I know.
Alhamdulillah that you're here. Alhamdulillah.
So let's go for the other part. So if it's between 21 to 28 days, you're getting something that has basically the blackish, darkish, reddish color, the smell, the thickness, and basically it's the timing for a period. Well, that's basically your period. Okay, that's basically to know your period. But now the other type of bleeding, wait for that because this is important. Okay, and if there is a pregnancy, if we're talking about a pregnancy of 10 weeks, 11 weeks, okay, to 10 or 11 weeks and above. But if we don't know exactly, she doesn't recall when her last period was, so we're not really sure how far along the pregnancy was, whether that was due to an abortion or a miscarriage. We would look at the fetus that was basically miscarried or that we basically have. And if it has human features, so we're talking about it has eyes, legs right there, you could see small hands right there, then in that situation, which is usually about 10 weeks, okay, 10, 11 weeks, 12 weeks within that time frame, then in that situation, if there was a miscarriage or if there was an abortion, then the bleeding after that would basically be considered postpartum, okay, or nifas. If the fetus that was born, miscarried, it does not have human features, then the bleeding that is basically coming after is basically just considered as vaginal bleeding that is not postpartum and not period. Okay, now if we're speaking about postpartum, let's just use the word P. Okay, if we're talking about postpartum, meaning we're speaking about 10 weeks of pregnancy and above, if we're talking about that, then the bleeding that comes after is considered as postpartum bleeding. If it at any time finishes, well, good for you, make your ghusl, make your wudu and just pray. Okay, now, do you have to do ghusl every single time? No, khalas, you're finished. But if it continues, that bleeding continues, you've got up to day 40, according to the Shafi'is, and day 60, according to the Malikis. And in that situation, you would basically be considered within postpartum. Okay? If at any time it stops, we're speaking about, let's say, stopping and you're not getting any more bleeding from the postpartum, then simple. You would, even if it's the 4th, 5th day, well, lucky you. Okay, then you would make wudu for your salat just normal, and you would just live your life normally. Noura, what did you want to say, dear?
I just want to ask you. So I had 2 miscarriages.
Don't tell me details, Noura.
Oh no. I just yani
Okay.
Anybody could have it, yani. But can we, I mean, what is there anything in the Quran or Hadith about like what reward you'll get for going through that?
Oh, certainly. There are actually numerous hadith in regards to losing a son, but the hadith in regards to losing and having a miscarriage. Sayyidah Aisha had a miscarriage, by the way. The hadith
I never knew that.
Yeah, she had one miscarriage. She was really saddened by it. But anyhow, so the hadith, there's only one hadith in regards to miscarriage, and that it would basically weigh in, or that it would intercede for you, but that hadith is not authentic. Okay, but the other hadith where the Prophet ﷺ had actually said, whoever loses a loved one, and basically embraces patience, he said, لا أعلم له جزاء غير الجنة. I do not know any reward for them but Jannah. Okay, so loved one, whether we're speaking about a son or a daughter. In fact, there are a number of different hadith that speak about losing a son or a daughter and being patient, and how they would basically be one of those to intercede for their parents. That would be extremely hard. I mean, I had seen many parents lose their children. It's not something, and by the way, you would think that when they're young, that it's harder, but no. I had seen parents lose their sons at 20 and 21 and 23, and it was like they will always be their babies. They will always be their babies, even if they're 20. I had even seen mothers lose their children at age 50. So her son was 50 and she was 80 something. And to her, that's my baby. To her, that's my baby. And will she basically get the reward of intercession for being patient for the loss of her baby, even if it's a big baby? Yes. Yes, inshallah Rabbil Alameen, any patient, any patience, any hardship that one goes through, that on Judgment Day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will basically reward the person for their loss of their loved one, for whatever hardship that they would go through. Okay, going back to, so this is the menstrual, let's put that as menstrual, and postpartum. So we talked about the postpartum. Any bleeding, okay, that is not menstrual and that is not postpartum is going to be called istihada. It's this one, istihada. Sorry, I'm using the mouse to write istihada. Okay, that was excellent writing. Okay. Okay, istihada. So what is istihada? Istihada is basically simple. If it's not menstrual, it's not postpartum, it's istihada. So whether that was result of an infection, I don't know, you had some cyst and they removed the cyst and you started having this bleeding, or I don't know, you fell on something and basically got this bleeding, that would be istihada. That istihada. Is it a wudu breaker? Is it something that you would have to redo your wudu for every salah? Is it something that is a najasa in itself? Differences of opinions between scholars. So how do we treat it? Well, not treat it to mean treat it medically, but treat it meaning in terms of salah. So in terms of salah, like we said earlier, number one, the majority of the scholars said you would make wudu for every salah. Even if the bleeding is still persistent right there, yes, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Do what you need to do with, doing your precautions and all of that. That's a different story. But in terms of salah, don't worry about the bleeding. Even if it's gushing, yes, even if it's gushing, don't worry about it. Okay, that's istihada. So do I have to continuously change the pad or even, yeah, of course, well, if you have something like that, they usually don't recommend using tampons, but okay. But if you want to, and the doctors told you it was okay, do you have to change the tampon or change the pad? The answer is no, you don't have to. You don't have to. Do I have to insert something like a tampon according to the hadith? You can if you want to. If you wanted to insert something to basically just for the salah time, you can do that. Are you obligated? Some, they don't want to insert anything because she's afraid it might harm and probably rupture the hymen and all of that. Okay, that's a considerable concern. Okay, that area, just to keep that within the parameters of how do we understand menstrual, istihada, and postpartum. Just wanted to note that one. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them because this would actually mark the end of our class. By the way, I do actually have a series of YouTube videos going in details in that regard. So you could actually look them up and hopefully they would be very helpful, inshallah. So if there are any questions, and inshallah, I know I didn't give you a break, so I decided to give you the break at the end.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikha.
Walaikum salam.
With regards to sleep, so what I've understood is with dozing, wudu doesn't break, but if one goes into deep slumber, then wudu breaks.
So if you're dozing, you didn't fully fall asleep, then that doesn't break your wudu.
Okay.
Okay, I forgot to answer the rest of the question, so I guess I got carried away with that question in the chat, and then I forgot where and why I was answering those questions. Let's see. How about vaginal gas? Vaginal gas does not break the wudu. I understood that there are differences of opinions with regards to sleep. Okay, that one. Which chapter are we on from the book? On the right. Chapter. It says chapter 9, right there. Chapter 9. Right there. Okay. And let's see. We are going to be transitioning to our classroom on Canvas tomorrow. So you will be able to see our coursework week by week. Oh, person lacking insight, perhaps. Okay. Well, Ahlam, she's basically a psychologist, so she wouldn't tell us a nice word to use. Person lacking insight. Okay, but Ahlam, isn't a person lacking insight? I mean, educate me, because if you were to say a person lacking insight, I always was under the impression that insight is more of like some kind of an inspiration or has a vision that is far than surfaced vision. So Insight is clinical language, used to describe self-awareness and social awareness. Okay, well, thanks for the education, Ahlam. Just a reminder, if you didn't register, so yes, if you didn't register, please don't forget. And inshallah, if you have any questions, reach out to info@gemsoflight.com. Is it .com or .org, Noura? Okay, so the email basically.
It's both. We have both. Alhamdulillah.
Okay. So yeah, so this is it. Inshallah, subhanakallah wa bihamdik nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. And I'm happy, mashallah. I could see some people are really doing great and staying here. I could see Dr. Karima is here. I know what's her name was here as well. Asia, Zoom user. I know that Sister Khadija, Samira, Nisreen. So happy to see her. Maryam, and we got a lot of Maryams. Layla and Dr. Karima, Jarai. I love the name. And Noura, and Ustaza Umayya. So this is it, everybody. So happy to see you all. Inshallah. We'll see you tomorrow with our tafsir. Oh my God, whenever I'm off tafsir, I just feel like something's missing.
Subhanallah, we love it. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Yeah, I know. Tafsir is that area where you're letting the scholar speak, not me speak.
Subhanallah. Alhamdulillah.
Yep, that's it. So this is it. Inshallah, subhanakallah wa bihamdik nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, and we're basically going to take out that. How do you do this?
Yeah, we got